Hey geeks, welcome back to my channel. I'm Trey Guillotine and you're watching Geekly Trends, where I give a few thoughts about some of the geeky trends that have been going on in the past week. Square Enix might be working on remaking some more video games. There's some rumors about a Shaun of the Dead sequel. The first Mass Effect Andromeda book has been given a release date. And What We Do in the Shadows is getting a sequel. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it around so others can join in the conversation. Let's get started on this week's Geekly Trends. So with the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake slowly approaching, Square Enix has been talking about the possibility of what they want to do with some of the older games in this Final Fantasy series on the PlayStation 1. As far as I know, there are no concrete plans for this, but they say that doing a simple remaster of all of the PS1 Final Fantasy games would be a disservice. Which so far we've seen them remaster like Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII, which weren't that bad graphically. They polished it up a little and just made it a little bit shinier for current gen systems. But once you go back past Final Fantasy X, you got 7, 8, and 9 as the kind of first 3D graphics games of the series, and they're already doing a remake of Final Fantasy VII, so ideally they would do a remake as well of Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX, or even some remakes of earlier Final Fantasies that aren't even 3D, that are just pixelated. I would love to see Final Fantasy VIII and IX get the remake treatment that Final Fantasy VII is getting, as I'm super excited for Final Fantasy VII, and if Final Fantasy XV is any kind of indication of the quality of that game, I'm very much into it. My biggest comment about Final Fantasy VII, and it actually goes for Final Fantasy VIII too, that the dated mechanics of that game do the stories a disservice. Even though Final Fantasy VIII was one of the mushier, heartfelt stories that I'm not super into, it was still a decent story that just the gameplay mechanics were kind of infuriating for me, especially the junction system. Like, I was fine drawing magic and assigning the GFs, but that was about it. The rest of the junction system was you had to assign the magic to the attack so that you would have that element in your attack, but you had to switch it around based on who you're going to fight, but you didn't know who for me, it was overcomplicated, and it made me enjoy the game less. And then Final Fantasy IX, I really had no problems with Final Fantasy IX, aside from it was still a little confusing, but every Final Fantasy game is going to be a little confusing. And if they even went back further and total remakes of the earlier games before Final Fantasy VII, that would mean I would actually have the chance to experience the stories of those games on current systems, and I think that would actually be pretty cool. Edgar Wright, Simon Pegg were talking about the possibility of giving Shaun of the Dead a sequel. Now, Shaun of the Dead is, of course, part of the Cornetto trilogy, which is not really a trilogy in the usual sense, where it follows the same story and same characters, but kind of a trilogy of genre parodies. Shaun of the Dead pairing zombie movies. Well, apparently the idea of continuing the story of Shaun and Ed and Liz from Shaun of the Dead isn't that big of a stretch. They've talked about it before, and before I go any further, there's no plans for it, there's nothing in development. This is simply just them talking about what they would like to do, and Simon Pegg actually wrote a treatment for a sequel to Shaun of the Dead called From Dusk Till Shaun. Of course, it would be dealing with vampires, but it would be a sequel to Shaun of the Dead. So you'd still have Shaun, you would have Ed, you would have Liz fighting vampires, somehow fighting and dealing with vampires. This is also a world that's already now infested with domesticated zombies, which maybe by the time that sequel would happen, they would have figured out a way to give consciousness back to the zombies, so Nick Frost wouldn't just be shambling around groaning, or maybe he would. Nothing is planned. This is merely Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg and Nick Frost talking about what they might like to do should they ever get the right script, and also if their schedules do line up. Mass Effect Annihilation, which is the first book that will be continuing the stories in Mass Effect Andromeda, has been set to release for June 26, 2018, and is written by Catherine M. Valenti. The story will specifically be focusing on the Quarian arc, and what happened or what is happening on the Quarian arc when they reach Andromeda. And they actually tell you what's wrong in the release announcement of the release date for Mass Effect Annihilation. So now I'm going to tell you it's a pathogen. Someone on the arc, or before it took off, somehow introduced a pathogen that is killing off members of the different species on the arc, the Quarians, the Drell, the Hanar, and the Batarians. They're trying to find out who it is, the mystery behind it. That's all the information they give, that it is like a pathogen, a sabotage kind of situation with a pathogen. Will I be reading this book? No. After all of the drama with Mass Effect Andromeda, or rather, the Mass Effect Andromeda, it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth for the game. Going back and trying to replay it, or even just playing the multiplayer, which I enjoyed the game and I enjoyed the multiplayer, but even going back and trying to do those, I just don't want to. It still hurts. I think I still need to put like time and distance between me and Mass Effect to let that wound heal, because they had a perfectly good game and they just let it die. They didn't even let it die, they planned for it to die. And they left so many interesting stories on cliffhangers. So, and now they're going to tell us the ends of these stories through books and comics, unless like the facial animations in the comics aren't good enough, and then they're just not even going to do that. I don't want to read this book when it does come out. I will just look up what the synopsis is and what actually happens in the book, and then I'll find out what happens in the Quarian arc, but I won't be reading this book. And I kind of have a feeling a lot of other Mass Effect Andromeda players and Mass Effect fans aren't going to be reading this book either. So with Thor Ragnarok coming out this week, the director Taika Waititi has been kind of doing the rounds promoting the film and also talking about some of his past and future works. So if you haven't seen it, which I didn't see it until a couple months ago when it was introduced to me, he did a movie, I want to say in 2015, called What We Do in the Shadows. It was a mockumentary vampire group house situation. It was just about how these vampires are like living in this house, how they're functioning in society. It was very funny. If you haven't seen that movie, go see it now. If you are a fan of that movie, then you're in luck, because a bunch of projects surrounding What We Do in the Shadows are in development. So first off, there is a sequel coming for What We Do in the Shadows, and it's going to be called Werewolves, which of course harkens to the werewolves in the movies and the werewolves not swearwolves, which is probably my favorite quote from that movie. But it's also getting a TV show spin-off that will be filmed in New Zealand, where the movie takes place, and will be focusing on the cops that you see in What We Do in the Shadows when they're like walking through the house talking about the code violations, as they kind of deal with the different supernatural elements of that town that they live in. And then the big news, in my opinion, what I'm most excited for, is that What We Do in the Shadows is going to be adapted into a US TV show, much like The Office. I don't have any other news on like how they're going to adapt the story to an American setting. The article that I was reading that was talking about this announcement was mentioning that New Orleans would be a great setting for that, and I totally agree. I would love to see a New Orleans mockumentary of vampires living in like a group home in the Quarter, or even like in the Warehouse section, or the Irish Channel, or Frenchman Street, whatever. I think that would be a great setting. I would love to see this. I'm very excited about all three of these things. Seeing What We Do in the Shadows also gave me a lot more confidence in how Thor Ragnarok is going to be. When you're planning your next Wizard World Comic-Con experience, make sure to use the discount code GuillotineGeek online to get 10% off your ticket purchase, and use those savings to buy some merch or meet a celebrity. What do you think of this week's Geekly Trends, and are there any other trends that you'd like to talk about? Let me know in the comments, and follow me on all the internets. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it around so others can join the conversation. You can check out my written content at guillotinegeek.blogspot.com, and you can support my future content by visiting my Patreon. And subscribe to my channel to geek out some more. Thanks for watching, and have fun. So Captain America, Thor, Hulk.